Rookie pass catchers in great early season roles and everything else that mattered the most from week one, plus the zero RB universe and some rankings discussions. That's what we're doing on a jam-packed day of Stealing Bananas. I'm Ben Gretch. You can find the Stealing Signals newsletter at bengretch.substack.com. With me, as always, is Shawn Siegele. You can find all of his great work over at RotoViz. Been writing for days, both of us, Shawn. I got Stealing Signals out. I wrote a couple extra pieces. It's been a lot of processing since our long Sunday night recap show. You have gotten the zero RB universe piece out. You have your top 100 rankings coming soon as we record this. So you have been hard at work over the last, however many days it's been. I don't know. Time blends together at this point as well. How are you doing?
Good. I always love the weeks where we get the Stealing Signals and then we get multiple additional pieces from Ben Gretch. Those always make me really excited. I had a chance on Monday morning to write up sort of the Texans Colts game and discuss some of the things that you and I had covered on Sunday night. That show went for 3 hours. You can obviously get it on Ben's YouTube Stealing Signals. Both of those shows have released on the Stealing Bananas airwaves, cut into two to make them a little bit more digestible there, but you've got the whole thing. That discussion is always my absolute favorite thing as I get ready for the next week. Then obviously those are instant reactions. We have a chance to work through all of the numbers a little bit more. And so when we get back together on Thursday, we can get the fuller reaction, see if things have changed at all as we work through the week. It's also interesting because obviously I don't have to deal with all of the stuff on social media in the way that you do, which can be good, and bad. But I mean, this week for me has just been so much fun. If not for the injuries to some of our key guys, this would have been, one of the, if not the best week one in recent memory. And yet there are still so many things you also have gotten wrong. And so we work through all of those things. I'm excited to get your takes on a variety of players. But in addition to the players, thinking through where we are as a fantasy landscape. And it probably doesn't surprise people that we think, especially when it comes to some trends and the environment, the landscape, that probably people are not thinking about it correctly, or that at least some of the things that are out there are going to prove to be misleading. And it's always tricky because, you and I like to discuss this from the perspective of it being a humility-based outlook to understand how wide the future ranges still are for so many people. And yet the flip side of that is that people who want what happened in week one to answer all the questions, if you push back on that, they don't feel like it's necessarily humility, but in some cases the opposite. All of those things to work through are what make life fascinating, fantasy football fascinating. It's one of the reasons that we can do this for entertainment in addition to trying to win contests, because there are very reasonable disagreements for engaged, intelligent people to have after week one.
I loved your post on the Colts and Texans. I forgot to mention that. I knew you had written something else that I definitely found time to read. But like I said, it's been a whirlwind few days. I also loved during that time, my interactions with you were like, you were like, man, that was a fun week one. Things went well. And then I'm out on Twitter and elsewhere, and it's like, everything we believe is wrong, right? But it is funny because, Shawn, we approach things from a perspective. I say that not to say that anyone's right or wrong necessarily. Obviously, I think we're right, but I'm not trying to be like faux humility there. But it's this dichotomy where you from a private perspective, very genuinely are just excited from an analyst perspective about the teams and what you think they're going to do. What you actually believe is going to happen this football season is positive for the things that we built. I'm not saying that people think it's widely negative, but I do think it was a very run heavy week one. Play volume was down, running back scored, not a lot of receivers scored, and people are a little bit panicked about that. Elite tight ends didn't score. So there's a little bit of like the points weren't there for the build structure that we have. I've seen a concern for that like the running back heavy builds are going to win. And what we talk a
I
lot
would
about
note that in week one, so I
every year.
was very open about the fact that I drafted a bunch of redraft teams that did have some running back heaviness because I felt like ADP was opening up opportunities and people were not effectively adjusting back from best ball. The interesting thing for me, and again, everyone's results are going to be different based on the very specific players you have in different circumstances, but in part because Jameson Williams is on some benches as the overall team depth is good. And if you swap him in for your lowest scorer, it's going to obviously look much better. But even hitting on basically every one of the running backs that I selected early, those teams still didn't actually do as well as the more normal builds who had fantastic weeks. So part of it is that when you have to get on the receivers that are undervalued. You can't just go draft receivers in general. There were a lot of receivers being drafted early who had no business being where they were. And those players, some of those players are going to bounce back. That's one of the things that we know. I mean, Amon-Ra St. Brown is going to have a good season, but some of the guys who were drafted because they feel safe, they're 26, 27 years old, they have a very clear role. But if the player has never been elite and the offense is not elite and target competition has been added, that's not the guy that you want. I mean, I don't know how much.
It's very simple. It's like, it seems simple. I don't know. Sorry. That sounded very cocky. Like you said, it's meant to be a humility based approach, but then it comes across sometimes. Well, I don't help that. I know I come across condescending in a lot of ways, but it's yeah, I mean, I think that makes sense to the listeners who have listened for a long time. And so it is an interesting thing to hear after week one, a lot of confidence in a lot of different things. You mentioned some of the early running backs. It was really awesome to see some of the guys that we were higher on get some really fun roles. Achane was used really excitingly in the passing game and was that sort of third target for the Dolphins. Obviously, the Bijan and Bree stuff was fantastic. Gibbs looked really great, and you talked about how he at the 1-2 turn was still very much in play, and have written about how he's probably closer to those big three.
The two guys who were closest to the EP double this week, and Gibbs barely missed it, but Gibbs and Achane, and you're like, it's hard to actually see those guys maintaining that. But if you get it in week one, and I don't think that they can necessarily maintain that, obviously, tonight. So we're not going to know as we record this, but we're going to get more information about how healthy Achane is. David Montgomery was involved mostly on the first and final drives for Detroit. But if you get that profile from those guys or anywhere close to it, they're going to be absolute home run picks. I mean, the injury to Achane and the injury to Kenneth Walker really were the two big daggers from week one, in addition to obviously the Jordan Love thing, the Jordan Addison situation. Because, I mean, Achane and Walker looked like they were going to, I mean, still you're going to have probably a hard time getting to that Breece Hall, Bijan Robinson level. Robinson was one of the ones who was interesting where when I went back and dug into the SIS numbers, I mean, partly he just was in a horrible situation in week one, and maybe some of that continues, but he had a much better week from a peripherals perspective than I sort of felt watching, where I wanted him to be even more dynamic with his cuts to break a big play. And they had him as evading a ton of tackles. I mean, Bijan Robinson evaded more tackles than basically every other back that people are excited about early and in the dead zone combined. Right.
Yeah.
Which, again, that doesn't mean that he's necessarily going to outscore them. Your scheme, your blocking, all of those things are going to matter. But, I mean, one of the things that has become just very, very clear and people would say it was always been clear, is that the peripherals are highly indicative of how good the back is, and that does matter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Kenneth Walker, you mentioned another one. I was going to also throw Kyron Williams out there as far as some of the early running backs that hit. You mentioned him being the best value since LaShawn McCoy. People were very concerned about the workload. Blake Corum doesn't play a single snap, and now Kyron Williams looks very much like that thesis that from a usage perspective, he was a pretty huge value. And some of the highest stake stuff that we drafted in the last few weeks. He was going as late as the early 4th round and played 91% of the snaps in week 1. I mean, that's a massive role. And if that actually sticks, there's no saying that it will for the entire year. Because I think Corum's a great example of something we're going to talk about, which is, again, it's week 1. A lot of these teams are going to bring rookies along slowly and those types of things. Go ahead.
And it's one of these deals where I didn't understand why people were drafting Blake Corum where they were drafting him. I thought Kyron Williams was a great pick, but I also thought that there was a chance that I would be wrong in week 1. I mean, there's a chance, but I also think now that if you're out on Blake Corum after week 1, it really didn't make sense to do some of the things.
You shouldn't have drafted him.
It's not that dissimilar to, like, one of the things that I wrote up in the article about the Chargers is that I was ecstatic to see what J.K. Dobbins did, but I always felt that the Kamani Vidal thesis had a lot more to do with Gus Edwards, who looked bad. And so, I mean, if you drafted Vidal, you should actually be pretty encouraged by week 1.
Backflips.
And maybe there's a situation in which you'd feel a lot better if he had been active and both backs had looked bad. I mean, that would be the best case scenario. But I mean, he's still well positioned. I mean, Jalen Wright, again, we know it's a mistake to talk about guys who are going to immediately play here this evening, maybe before the show releases. But I mean, there are so many young players, especially at running back, who are going to have big seasons, and then I don't know what's going on out there in terms of the discussion of like high value running backs, running back dead zone, contingency based plays, running back handcuffs, all of those types of things. But both the players that I was right about and the players that I was wrong about for week 1, on all of those guys, you have to expect the second wave of running backs to have a huge role this season. Week 1 didn't change any of that.
Doesn't change any of that, no. And so as we're talking through the running backs, one of the ways I wanted to frame it was to actually start with the rookie receivers, because I think, and I've mentioned this now a couple places, but I think one of the biggest under the radar, or I'm not hearing it discussed enough, takeaways from week 1 was the rookie receiver group, because what we're looking for early in the season with the receivers is routes and efficiency, a role and an ability to produce. I think it's hard for rookie receivers right away in week 1 to have like a massive target role. That is just always bullish as well if you get that with it. But they're playing, and when they get their opportunities, they're doing good stuff. They're actually making some plays. I said to you before the show that, like, Keon Coleman and Ladd McConkey, if you made me pick who was going to be this year's Quentin Johnston, I probably would have been, with one of those types of guys. They both catch like 4 or 5 balls. I don't know. And I said to you kind of jokingly, I don't know if Quentin Johnston did at any point all of last season. The fact that those guys came out and had big route rolls, I think McConkey was about 78% routes. Keon was at 90%. And again, here's another dude that's going to play on Thursday night, probably goes catchless on Thursday night as I'm sitting here recording this with you on Thursday morning. But I was very encouraged by both of them having good routes rolls and doing a little bit, catching some balls, doing some stuff. McConkey late scores the touchdown that puts the game away for them. After Joshua Palmer had dropped a pass right on his frame that was one of the best passes of the week that Justin Herbert drops in behind defenders in the back of the end zone. I mean, I looked at that Chargers game and I was like, man, the rookies are going to matter this year for these guys, because the veterans weren't as good as they could have been in week 1, right? Palmer looked like a guy who left some points on the field. Gus Edwards looked done in week 1 right away. That doesn't mean he's going to look done the whole year, but again, like, we're talking about some of these other veteran backs that people played for role and for volume. And the reality is that they can look efficient and spry in week 1 in a lot of the cases and then lose that. It does tend to fade, and sometimes fairly quickly for the older backs. On Sunday night, I use the example of David Johnson in his first year with the Texans, looked amazing in the first game, 7 yards per carry. It was like 11 for 77 rushing, had some receiving yards, and everyone was like, David Johnson's back. And the next like 5 games, he was under 4 yards per carry and ended up being a complete bust that year. It happens sometimes with the veteran backs where in week 1, they're ready to go, they're primed, whatever. And then they start to take some hits in season and things just don't go as well the rest of the year, what have you. I mean, I don't know the exact reasons. I'm kind of speculating there, but Gus Edwards looked bad from week 1, and you talked about that with Vidal. I think the fact that McConkey looked like possibly their best receiver in week 1 matters. I think when you look around the league, the elite rookie receivers, part of the reason this isn't getting probably as much hype as Marvin Harrison. Everyone's talking about his GPS timed score. You may not have seen this because you're not on social, but he was one of the lowest GPS timed scores in the entire database. It's something like 17,000 players who ran X amount of routes, 15 routes or something. He was one of the very lowest. Bill Barnwell mentioned this. I did his show yesterday, mentioned it to me. It's like 30th from the bottom out of like 17,000 players. His high speed was like 16 miles per hour, which obviously we know he's faster than that. He's not like that slow. It's either an effort thing or just wasn't in the game plan, or they were. Our buddy Pat Corain mentioned that the double team rate was high. Maybe he was just like frustrated and never really actually trying. But he has a rough game. Neighbors plays 100% of the runs a route on 100% of the dropbacks and looks pretty strong. But the offense looks poor, and Adunze gets hurt. And so the top 3 maybe weren't as exciting as you'd want them to be, but Xavier Worthy looks in a role, efficient, and a stud right away, right? Brian Thomas looks like he might be the number 1 for the Jags right now. He's in the Calvin Ridley role and probably their best wide receiver. I feel like I missed on that one. He's a guy that I've had issues with the target earning, but the efficiency was just so clear on this guy, and they're going to use him intelligently and get him the ball. It was so exciting. I mentioned Keon. I mentioned Ladd. Xavier Legette, I thought, looked really good in week 1. Sean, your dude, Brock Bowers, we're going to switch over to tight end, but we're talking about him before the show a little. Like, if you had any kind of excitement about Brock Bowers, the role, the usage, the targets, he's one of only 3 tight ends that gets more than 5 targets in week 1. He's a rookie. And if the thesis was he could be this year's Sam Laporta, we just saw that he's going to be this year's Sam Laporta. The point is not that they did amazingly in week 1 and scored all these points in week 1. It's that when you see those roles, and you know that they are rookies whose roles will grow, and these teams are just easing them in really early on, but they're going to be more part of the offense late. And you're trying to predict, how do I win in week 15 to 17? Not how do I win in week 1? That was the biggest takeaway to me, is that group that I just named, those guys, Jalen McMillan, Adonai Mitchell, who you mentioned had the 2 misses on our Sunday night show that weren't on him. He was open twice, but Richardson missed him. He could have scored very well, but looks the part and played, and it looks like he's going to be a part of this offense and fits with what they want to do vertically with the passing game. These guys are going to matter this season. That's the type of takeaway, not who scored 70 points in week 1, but who is going to develop and score in weeks 15 and 17. I think the rookie receivers were the best thing we can point to and say, no one can argue that was bullish.
And one of the interesting things there too, and this isn't to say that Harrison and Neighbors won't score, because I think that they will. But this season was set up really interestingly to take advantage of second-year receivers who had already broken out, and then to get a lot of exposure to rookie receivers at good prices, which Harrison especially didn't represent. And so, you work through it, and exactly as you mentioned, with Legette there, not that far behind in routes and leads and targets. You have Thomas not very far behind in routes and easily the most dynamic player out there. That just popped off the screen. I was surprised at the number of routes that Worthy had, and it would have been great if he had drawn another target or 2, but the route share was surprising. McConkey, as you mentioned, just barely behind Palmer and QJ. Jalen McMillan, according to SIS, ran the same number of routes as Chris Godwin, and he was missed like 3 times. One of them, I believe, doesn't show up because it was a penalty. Yeah, he draws 22 DPI yards there. And then
I was confused
Coleman,
about that because I knew he had two near misses, and then I went back and watched because he didn't have the air yards or something. I was like, oh, I must have been envisioning that, but that's what it was. It was a DPI, the other one. Yeah.
And then, as you mentioned, Coleman just led the way for the Bills. And I mean, there are enough red flags in his profile, and there's enough balance to this passing offense. And frankly, the game plan looked awful enough that I think a little bit of skepticism is probably in order, but maybe not that much, because I mean, those other guys are like deep role players, which is one of the reasons that you didn't want to draft them. And again, that's another thing that went well, is that we have very little exposure to the other players on those teams. Now, it's obviously different with Rashee Rice and the Chiefs. It'll be interesting to see with the Panthers. I haven't had a chance. That game has been like the final thing on my list for a long time. Ben, I don't think it will shock you to discover that Bryce Young ranked 30th in points above average in passing this week.
It actually does shock me because 30th is not 32nd. That's higher than I would have expected. Who's behind him?
Caleb Williams was worse.
Okay, that makes sense.
And
Daniel Jones?
Daniel Jones was worse.
Daniel Jones, yeah.
But I mean, it's a really bad sign when you're like not competitive with Will Levis and with what Bo Nix did. So
that did not look good. I'm very frustrated about how much I went to bat for Deontay Johnson, who's one of those really boring players that I don't typically go to bat for. And most of you and the ship chasers and everybody I play with was like, really, Deontay Johnson? He's not going to get there. He's not going to get there with this QB play. I still think he's a good play because he gets open. In theory, I should say. It's not going to look good if they don't get that squared away really quickly. I mean, if you want to tell yourself a story, apparently they were blitzed a ton in week 1. Maybe he's not particularly good under the blitz. Maybe they'll do some things differently. Do they still have Marshawn Lattimore? I don't even know the answer to this. Was Johnson getting shadowed? Sorry.
Blitzing is legal. So I think that
it's still legal. Okay.
Right. That may be an issue that they have to.
Lattimore's hurt. He wasn't even, I don't even think he was. No.
Yeah,
anyway,
Deontay.
The receivers are a really positive thing. Yeah. That we'll see what happens with that. I mean, there's nothing you can really take away from week 1 with the Panthers other than this might be a legitimate issue for the whole year. And if you have Deontay, I'm not really playing him. I'm just sort of hoping to see something in week 2. The rookie receivers were really interesting. Part of the reason I wanted to set the stage with those guys is to really dive into more, Sean, your Zero RB Universe piece, which breaks down all of the running backs every week at RotoViz. Obviously, make sure you're subscribed and reading it over there. I mentioned you have not had a chance yet to read it, but I wanted to pick your brain about it. I've looked at a couple of the key takeaways and things. It did just post later in the day yesterday, and I'm up here recording with you first thing in the morning. But everyone else should go read it. It is, I mean, first of all, it's a obviously very, very important piece. But week 1, you're talking through all of the scenarios, all of the things that you saw, what it means. I love that you did like the good and the bad as it relates to the different teams and the situations, and broke down some different things, short term, intermediate term, a look ahead. I wanted to talk about the rookie running backs because we kind of already alluded to this and joked about it. But when I was on with Barnwell yesterday, he also mentioned that in ESPN leagues, Blake Corum was the most dropped player. And that just doesn't make a lot of sense to either you or me, that if you're drafting Blake Corum, yeah, I mean, like you were hoping for a little bit of standalone value. But the main thing that everyone was saying was that you have the potential for a massive workload. And when you see Kyron in a 91% workload, what you should learn to some degree is they're still doing that thing that they've always kind of done, which makes it a backfield that you want the primary backup in, because it can be thrust into that role with one injury potentially. Like, I don't know that Corum would necessarily get thrust in that role immediately. They'd probably play Ronnie Rivers a little, but I saw some people adding Ronnie Rivers. Ronnie Rivers is, I don't think, in a Kyron Williams injury scenario going to play over Blake Corum, who was a day 2 pick, who they talked about as a clone for Kyron Williams, etc. Ronnie Rivers is probably doing some of those veteran things, that they want him to do, and that allowed him to be the guy who played the other 9% of the snaps. But really, it was a Kyron Williams game, and Corum is the backup to Kyron Williams. I mean, that's the way that I would read it. These rookies in week 1, a lot of people are concerned. Vidal inactive, Jalen Wright inactive. You mentioned we're recording this on Thursday. He's going to be active for Thursday night. We might already have evidence by the time somebody is listening to this pod that the Jalen Wright stuff worked. But the point is, like, all of these types of plays, they move one direction. It's the whole concept of anti-fragility. These teams invested in these players. We already saw Bucky Irving start to do some great stuff early. And also, more importantly to me, that Rachaad White was dead last in next gen stats, rush yards over expected in week 1 for the entire NFL, 15 carries for 31 yards. That's like, how long are they going to do that? I've compared him to Najee last year, where Najee was going into year 3 and had been inefficient the first 2 years. And people were saying, well, he's a workhorse. He's going to be a workhorse. And the team doesn't do it forever. And in year 3, they started to play a lot more Jaylen Warren. Rachaad White struggling as a runner can't happen forever. Bucky Irving plays. He's the clear number 2, and he plays pretty well. He gets, I think it was 12 opportunities, 11 touches in week 1. Yeah, they were in a positive script and all of those things, but and Irving's peripherals weren't amazing. He had some good blocking on his runs, but he was a lot more efficient in terms of yards per carry. We've already starting to see what I think will lean his way throughout the season. Those rookies are panicking people, Sean, but it's week 1. It's week 1, right?
It is. And it seems strange to me that we would have all of these discussions for years and years, but especially this off season, and understand what was almost certainly going to happen. And then, so one of the fun things that I've been working on is a rest of season top 100. And when you force yourself to re-rank everyone, you find out how strong your conviction is on certain players and what you really think happened in week 1. And those things are interesting at a very individual player level as well. One of the things that I would encourage people to kind of keep in mind simultaneously is that the trends that we see year after year after year are, generally speaking, going to take place again in 2024. Now, one of the things that I've mentioned, and I don't think it's impossible that this is the season for it, is that in a similar way to what happened in 2016, where we had the 2015 running back apocalypse, you do have a big move in ADP. And then that following season, there were specific running backs who were pretty significantly undervalued. And then as a group, the guys stayed healthy. And a running back heavy attack worked really well. And then as a result, people drafted inefficiently for another 5 years. And so the question for a lot of people is going to be, do you want to bet on 2016 or do you want to bet on being right almost all of the time? But even if you're going to bet on being right almost all of the time, you do have to understand that a 2016 is going to happen. And so if a 2016 happening undermines your confidence in everything that happens all of the other times, or undermines your confidence in a certain way of drafting, then you want to make sure you don't draft that way so that you don't have that experience, because there are other ways that you can do it that will, be moderately successful. Right.
What if my experience is that I just get really mad at people who think week 1 matters, and we draft a certain way that, like, things change after week 1? And should I just draft for week 1 from now on because I get so mad about these things?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that you have to do is you have to manage your own emotions. And so, like, if being able to handle the gap between week 1 and week 2 is more important than putting your teams in position to win millions of dollars, then yes, draft inefficiently. Everybody else should draft the way that's going to give you the best chance to win. But again, knowing that you're not always going to be right, both on the individual player level and from a trends perspective. But again, the thing that is so fun about this is, I mean, it's mind-boggling to me that we would ever have a conversation about the running back dead zone not existing. You can say it's in a different spot, or you can say that there are players who have a dead zone profile who are being drafted above. I mean, if you're being drafted below, it doesn't really make sense because obviously that's where they should be drafted. But the idea that players who have poor peripherals, who are not viable long-term starting running backs, but are thrust into a week 1 role and are going to score okay because of volume, that suddenly everything we know about those players no longer exists. I mean, that's a ridiculous way to look at things. Price does matter. And so if you're going to get some shots at guys who are weaker players, I mean, one of the things, for example, is James Conner and Aaron Jones were 2 players that I was very high on for this season, in part because they actually are good players. Now, there are some age types of things, there are some backup types of things that make them a little bit more fragile. And if they had been drafted where they would have been drafted 2 or 3 years ago, we would have been completely out. We were still mostly out with where they were drafted, right? But I mean, you can go after players who were good when you get these big discounts. You still can't go back to simply saying, oh, well, let's draft bad players. The bad players are going to be replaced, and you're not going to get the points when you need them. It seems weird to constantly bring up Rashad Penny and Jerick McKinnon, or even someone like a Devin Singletary, who right now is in that weird, I'm a dead zone running back, but in the past has been one of those guys where if you just had him for a certain stretch, you were golden, right? But the things that have continued to happen so recently are that you've gotten the huge scores. Before, there was this tension between getting the backs who are going to potentially go off for 70, 80, 90 points in the fantasy playoffs, or building a good overall team. That tension has gone away to an extent because you're not getting those guys. And then in week 1, I mean, the guy who can really give that didn't play and may not play. Certainly doesn't seem like he's in any position to have that type of season as we work forward. But then you have been asking me about the rookie running backs. I have kind of gone in a different direction with it, but partly because I mean, the rookie running backs are going to be fine. There's just not even anything there, I don't think. Both for the guys that we were excited about and the guys that we're not excited about. If you drafted Blake Corum and Kamani Vidal and Jalen Wright and Braylon Allen and certainly Bucky Irving, you've got to be pretty excited. I mean, the player that I am nervous about, in part because I think the offense is going to be worse than I had hoped, and in part because teams will default to being overly conservative, especially early in the season, but then sometimes it ends up not developing. I'm legitimately nervous about Chase Brown. I mean, that's a guy where I thought there was a really good thesis. And I mean, the Cincinnati Bengals are a joke, right? We're long past the point in time that we could still be giving this coaching staff credit for having been to a Super Bowl. It looks like, Joe Burrow and Jamar Chase and company got them there in spite of the organization.
Well, I will say on that, I won't necessarily dispute that point, but a big part of their week 1 offensive concerns, I mean, there's multiple layers. T. Higgins is out. Jamar Chase has food poisoning, and the secondary players don't play particularly well in this game at all. But they only had 8 possessions because they couldn't stop the Patriots running the ball. You mentioned some of the advanced metrics. Ramondre Stevenson's advanced metrics looked incredible. They're running into run looks, and he's still getting positive yardage. He's all the way back. I mean, the Ramondre Stevenson stuff, we talked last offseason about how good his peripherals were in the first 2 years, and they were a little bit weaker last year. I don't know if he was playing hurt or what, but it's so exciting for Patriots fans and for a young player that is a fun guy to watch, that he's just going to be a really good runner of the football. Patriots won this game by controlling the ball and keeping the clock running. Very old school style of football, right? Low scoring game. They get an early touchdown and then they just stay out ahead of the Bengals. The Bengals had some bad possessions, so they created this problem themselves. They only got 8 possessions despite 4 3-and-outs, though. A lot of times when you only get 8 possessions, you at least do something on your own, because the Bengals basically didn't hold the ball very long. They got 3-and-outs on their first 3 drives. I think they were trying to run a little bit too much early on. Their last drive before half, Mike Gesicki catches what's originally ruled a touchdown on a great ball by Burrow on a corner route. It is overturned on replay because he couldn't hold it going to the ground. Very next play, Burrow hits Tanner Hudson over the middle. He's vertical and running into the end zone, but gets the ball a little bit away from his body, gets it punched out at the 2-yard line. If he just covers it up with 2 arms, he's not getting tackled before he goes in. The only play that I would have mentioned was to punch it.
That you brought the Gesicki thing up on Sunday night, and then my FFPC that was starting him did lose because of the combination of CMC being held out and that touchdown being overturned.
That's brutal.
I apologize. Like 155 to 151.
Oh, man. With both those guys not doing much, still got 151 and lost still. That's brutal. So that was their first 4 drives in the first half, Sean. Their first drive of the second half, they move the ball into New England territory, and Tanner Hudson has a drop on a ball. It's a little bit behind him on a 3rd and 2. Should have caught it, in my opinion. And then on 4th and 2, they run a swing pass to Andre Joseph, and he just does not get upfield quick enough. It's a 4th and 2, and he's kind of taking his time running laterally in the backfield. A Patriots defender comes down on him hard and tackles him. Turnover on downs. They get a touchdown and a field goal on the next 2 drives. And then on their 4th drive, they get backed up a little bit in their own territory to start the drive. They have a drop on 2nd down. I want to say it was Zach Moss, or just a missed connection there. 3rd down, Burrow goes underneath again to the running back and completes. It's now 4th and 5, and they punt from their own 15, down 6 with, like, I don't know what it was, 2.5 minutes left. They decide they're going to punt because they don't want to give up a turnover on downs on their own 15. They don't see the ball again after that. So, yeah, I mean, some of it is like, why are you punting in that spot? Like, I mean, I understand it. You're your own 15-yard line, but go for it. You didn't get the ball back. That's how you lose. Some of it is the run defense, which could potentially be more of an issue the rest of the year as well. But as far as like watching the Bengals 8 possessions closely, there was some stuff that didn't go well in the first couple of possessions. There's some plays that just, like, they get a drop on a 3rd down. They get a drop touchdown. They get a fumble on one of their good possessions. There's a couple that early in the game, they're doing run, pass type stuff that's just a little bit not creative enough, but they did go really pass heavy. They had the highest pass rate over expected the rest of the way. They did actually go and try to lean into this a little bit.
Brown.
It did. Well, Chase Brown caught a couple passes. The bottom line is they only end up running 48 total plays in this game. I'm not like a lot of people are concerned about the Bengals. I would say that I am not entirely done with the Bengals. I think, like, look ahead to week 4, week 5.
But this wasn't against the 49ers like we got on Monday Night Football, was out, where the Jets also ran a very low number of plays. And it's hard not to be frustrated with Garrett Wilson after week 1 because he made some bad plays. He, like, doesn't bother to get his second foot down.
That was annoying.
But 11 targets in a game where they ran 49 plays.
Yeah.
You mentioned the peripherals for Ramondre Stevenson, right? So Joe Mixon, Jonathan Taylor, Saquon Barkley, Kyron Williams combined for 1 evaded tackle on the week.
Some of those guys had some big numbers. Joe Mixon had some huge numbers.
1 evaded tackle, and it was given to Saquon Barkley. I guess I would dispute that a little bit. I mean, how you grade some of those things is going to
Barkley
depend.
Looked good.
And he had 59 yards after contact, and so you can combine some of this. One of the reasons that I really like going through the SIS numbers is that as opposed to having, say, one number, and this is in no way casting aspersions on the yards above expected, but you can see it from so many different angles and what the guys did and how it fits into their profile and that type of thing. So those 4 guys combined for 1 evaded tackle. Ramondre Stevenson had 13.
That's crazy.
13.
It's a lot.
The other names who were kind of up in that ballpark, but still way back. Najee Harris, who it's never gonna turn into points, so it doesn't matter. But Najee Harris with 9, Jordan Mason with 8, Bijan Robinson with 7. So I mean, those are the guys who really popped. Kenneth Walker, 4 broken tackles, which was tied for the third most broken tackles.
I was just going to say, one of the things you could say about that is Ramondre's dealing with a situation where they don't have a pass threat, and he's going to have to do that just to get a decent run game out of it, versus like a Saquon. You've talked about the yards before contact again before, right? That was something we talked about with the Eagles in the past. That part of it looked good for Saquon, and he was able to find the holes that were there. There's one play that has made the rounds on social where the run's sort of to the right, and he moves back really smoothly behind the offensive line back to the left and finds a hole that's open on the backside and explodes through it. And you're like, that's the old Saquon Barkley. That's a real good read to see it all the way back behind where the play is and gets it was one of his big runs in that game. And it ends up being, everything on the front side was blocked fairly well, but there just wasn't really a hole. And it ends up being probably not a lot of evaded tackles or yards after contact or those types of things. But if it's blocked up really well and he's then going to go get the yards that are there, that's a positive as well. Obviously.
Yeah, his boom rate is going to be good. And so it looks like a fantastic fit. I obviously did move him way up, whereas I didn't necessarily with some of the other players like a Joe Mixon, who we can get to in a second. You mentioned what Ramondre Stevenson's going to have to deal with. 25 carries, 15 times hit at the line of scrimmage.
Yeah, that's not ideal. And that's something that it's really cool to see how good he is. And I do think he's a strong mid-round value at this point. Looking back at the mid-round valuation, you feel good about him on your roster right now if you took him in those spots. But I think what you're thinking about is how long till we get Drake May in there, maybe making this passing game look exciting too, because then Ramondre Stevenson could be really good down the stretch. I mean, and that's one of those things that is probably going to come and probably going to help influence Ramondre's whole system. He might have some down games here in the next 6 weeks or so, but I think down the stretch, Ramondre could be a big part of what matters for fantasy.
Yeah, and you mentioned all of the fantastic peripherals that Stevenson had going into, over multiple seasons and going into last year, and then how disappointing that was. That was certainly a reminder of the risk of taking even backs who, look like they're on the border of sort of that Uber back status so early. It's also a reminder of some of the risks that you get contextually, which, Ben, you and I take very seriously. It's certainly one of the reasons why a back like Najee Harris, who, he easily led the NFL in broken tackles last year. But it just isn't going to translate into fantasy, in part because his backup was actually far and away the best back in evasion rate. So when you have elite competition and you have a terrible offensive context, what week 1, I think, demonstrated more and more from the Patriots' perspective is, even though they have some real issues still, that what they did last season was really at a level where it did actually require the firing of person who is probably going to go down as the greatest head coach in NFL history. The offensive context and environment they created, what they tried to do, was that bad. And Stevenson didn't look like himself, but the context was certainly a big problem there. I mentioned Joe Mixon. Then one of my favorite notes from that upcoming rest of season rankings piece, where you have to try and figure out where to put a Joe Mixon, was this question of, is it possible to have a 159-yard rushing game where you're credited with 0 evaded tackles and you generate a 3% boom rate? Mixon would say that it was. That is what he did. On the other hand, I thought his vision was excellent. I mentioned to you that there was a play where he kind of subtly changed his angle and found the sliver of space. I don't think there's really anything there in terms of, one of the things that SIS reports to us is the designed gap. Sometimes when backs are hitting the design gap, at a really high percentage, it's a pretty big negative because they're not showing the creativity to get out of those plays when the defense has them stopped. But Mixon did use the design gap on 26 of his 30 attempts. How are you feeling about some of these players from a rest of season perspective? Mixon was somebody that I didn't move up a ton, in part because they had a really soft opening schedule. And this was a little bit the case as well, I should say, even though we just talked about the amazing number of evaded tackles, 5 broken tackles, 8 forced missed tackles for Ramondre Stevenson, which a back of his size to demonstrate that agility. And that was the thing that really popped for him, when he entered the league, is that this is a gigantic dude who just simply makes people miss. But I did mention, as we kind of look forward on some of these things from a schedule perspective, and I know that there are certainly lots of fantasy players out there who don't really want to take the defense into consideration. But I mean, last year the Bengals finished dead last in allowing forced missed tackles, and they were tied for the worst in the NFL in positive percentage allowed. They didn't improve on any of that against Stevenson and the Patriots. They're probably a team that you can attack. The same basic thing was true with the Indianapolis Colts. The Texans don't have that same type of schedule really going forward. And I think that they have to lean into the pass. At the same time, Dameon Pierce, somebody who didn't have a lot of touches, but was actually very good on the touches that he did have. This is a similar to me type of situation. It's something you want to be thinking about across all of your teams and across any type of environment where you are building rosters and trying to pack as much punch into them as you can. One of the things that we emphasized how you get the most bang for your buck at receiver, but also with running backs, if you really liked what Joe Mixon did, the smartest thing to do is to target the Houston backups. They're the players you can acquire. They're the players who, if they then score from the price that they are to you now, it actually makes a big difference to your roster. I think Pierce, an interesting name late.
That's a really good call. It's an interesting one. I was going to say, as far as Mixon's concerned, that when people ask sort of what to expect going forward, and you talked about where you were ranking him, I think my perspective on it would be that it's reminiscent of how we've talked about Pacheco in the past, where defenses aren't going to care about this player. So even if we don't necessarily think he's a very good runner, everything is going to be skewed positively for him. The light boxes and those types of things are going to be there. He's not going to have to break a whole bunch of tackles. You talked about it. Like, he got 159 yards without doing anything all that exciting in the peripherals. The way that happens is that you have a defensive game plan that is designed to stop CJ Stroud and these elite wide receivers, which is not going to stop. Like, that's exactly the way that every defense should play him, play this offense. Mixon's long on the day, 13 yards. That's another way to put it. That's sort of funny that he has a 159-yard rushing day and doesn't have a carry of 15 yards on the day. Usually you're talking about a guy getting a 30, 40-yard carry. For him, it was just and people say he fell forward at those things, and I think he did. Like, he looked good. He looked like the right type of back for this offense, frankly. He'll go get you 8 yards at times, right? And I think he had a lot of those 8, 9, 10-yard carries when the long is only 13 and he comes out with 160 yards. And that's fine. That scores, right? But if teams start to key on him for some reason or another, that goes away as well. Now, I don't think they would. Like, that, there's no real reason they will. So I think he'll be fine. He'll score. He's not going to be amazing. There's going to be games where they fall behind and they go really pass heavy. There's going to be games where they just are too efficient throwing the ball for him to really get his. Maybe late in the game, they're trying to get him some. Overall, I think he's going to score. But one of the reasons, we were out on Pacheco, and one of the reasons his price seemed a little steep this year, is that he's never really been the focal point of his offense, right? He gets like 15 carries, but doesn't usually get 20 plus. Now, Mixon in this first game gets 30, but I think in some respects it was like, hey, we're showing off our new toy. We just, we got this guy this offseason. We're gonna ride him. I think there's a little bit of that with Saquon as well. And I think going forward, you're going to need to get AJ Brown and Devonta Smith going more. But Saquon looked really good. And I'm not trying to dog him or rope him into that, but it is one of those other week one things
all
that
of
does
these
happen.
teams faced really weak run defenses, and that does matter. When you see someone like Kyron Williams go out there and get stuffed by Detroit, it's a different type of situation. So one of the things I thought was interesting here, Ben, is that we have Ramondre and Kyron. They had almost identical EP numbers, but Stevenson was plus 3.6 fantasy points over expectation. Williams was minus 3.1. The streamer had those guys with very different types of matchups. They're going to not have those same matchups every week, and the matchups at running back do make a big difference. Another kind of note, kind of building off of that I think can get lost when we have certain people look good, is that Zamir White -7, Rashad White -5, almost 6, Gus Edwards -5, Josh Jacobs -5, and Najee -4 in terms of FPOE. Right off the bat, we got indications that the types of profiles that you don't want to go after are already hurting fantasy managers.
And again, the thesis with those profiles is early season production. It is early work, right? Like we know time and again that these guys lose work. I think we often get the thing is like, well, why does that have to be the only thesis? Well, I don't know. Go back and look at the history of football. I don't really I don't usually have time for those types of questions. Those are the ones where I mentioned earlier getting upset about this type of stuff, but like what are we paying attention to? Like this, we've seen it time and time again. That's why the dead zone exists. That's why that stuff exists. If you want to play it for early season production, that's fine. And I think that's what a lot of people have made the case about as it relates to the cost of these profiles getting cheaper and thinking through, especially in managed, how they want their build to progress throughout the season and those types of things. I'm not saying it's right. I'm saying that those types of approaches, I think, are at least logically consistent with what we see every season. The idea that like we're just being unfair to inefficient lead backs having the potential to hold their volume all year, I think is far less supported by, again, the history of the way these seasons evolve. One of the things I wrote about in my piece this morning was that, and it was a free post over at bengresh.substack.com about this concept of anti-fragility, was that we put a lot of weight onto end of season numbers all off season, and we talk about the way that seasons went and how they finished and all of those types of things. And it also gives outsized weight to like Rashad White from last season, who I'm sure people are thinking about as I talk about this topic, who was inefficient. We talked about might lose his job all year, and he kept it all year, because those are the examples that then stick with people, because he did keep the job all year. They didn't really have a great alternative. There's a lot of examples from last year where the guys didn't keep their job, right? Like Dameon Pierce ended up losing his job to Devin Singletary, and Alexander Madison wasn't good enough to hold on to his work. And there's a lot of guys that were drafted like that last year that didn't keep their roles because they just weren't good enough. And the teams ultimately decide they want to go a different direction with it. But we talk in the offseason about, there's all this aggregate research that's done to end of season data and end of season numbers and how this looks and that looks. And nobody ever seems to remember or pay attention to how these seasons actually evolve in season, right? It's one of the things that you have talked about a bunch, and that I have taken from you in a way that you've emphasized it, is we're not drafting to like find answers to a set target, because the 2024 season, it's not like, oh, the whole offseason happened and who is the best pick for fantasy in 2024. It's the in-season in 2024 is going to have a huge evolution and changes, and things are going to be different. It's chaos all year long. We talk about this every way we can, but there's to me more difference between week 1 and week 17 than there even is in an off season sometimes, right? Like in the off season, these guys that were in the role at the end of the year prior often stick in their role. But the weekly feedback of this guy not being good enough, eventually the changes happen in season. I mean, the idea that week one predicts really anything is just, it's been proven time and again to not be particularly true. It's very anecdotal when you come up with like 2023 Rashad White as an example or a counter, because there's a lot of examples that go the other way with it.
And White did bring something to the table in terms of being a good receiving back that may potentially keep him in the mix here. I did think that it was surprising that we got so many clear lead back situations. Most of them, I think, anticipated, and yet it still will be interesting to track. But I thought the most encouraging things really came down to there being more reason to believe in the stars as opposed to more reason to believe in the dead zone guys, because we got the exact thesis that you had just been beating the drum about all offseason for Bijan Robinson. We got a fantastic work rate for Breece Hall. Now, some of that with the Jets could be they just didn't have the ball. And so you don't need to rest your guy when like, well, we're going to only have they had 49 plays, but it felt like about
37 plays with Rodgers. 12 of those came on the last drive when Tyrod Taylor came in. 37 with Rodgers.
Yeah, just like so ridiculous. Then the guys who were drafted kind of at the turn, and Jonathan Taylor and Saquon Barkley. And then you got good numbers for Pacheco. You got good numbers for Mason. That's sort of a unique situation because of CMC being out. You had good numbers for Joe Mixon. We already talked about Kyron Williams. It's going to be the stars that hold the workload, because that is what makes sense for NFL teams trying to win. You think about what happened in week one. The Chiefs acquire Samaje Perine. They try and use him a little bit. He drops a key pass. You would expect him obviously to be a lot more involved. One of the things that I think was frustrating for me is not this question of whether or not other backs are going to be involved, because the NFL has clearly moved in a direction where the vast majority of teams are going to be committees, but simply the teams weren't ready to deploy their committees in week one. They weren't ready to play. And I mean, some of that is the way that the rules work now, where teams are very limited in terms of practicing. That probably is a little bit frustrating to fans when you think about the money that the players get paid, what it costs to go to NFL games for the players union. I mean, I don't have a big stake in how many games there are. If you go down a game, that would be fine with me. I would like the teams to prepare and to look like professionals when they go into week one. One of the things that was interesting to me in the preseason was that the two-time defending Super Bowl champions played their guys. They put some plays on tape that defenses might have to account for. They got people like Xavier Worthy a little bit more ready. And probably it doesn't make a huge difference. I mean, we're talking about a matter of like 10 plays versus 0 plays. And certainly the teams that didn't show their guys at all were not exclusively bad. But outside of the primetime games, the quality of football was lackluster. And there's just too much money involved in this. And there's too much at stake for teams to not look ready to play. It's ridiculous for players who are under contract for multiple more years to be holding out. I want to see better football. I want to see guys like Blake Corum, even if I have 0 Corum. Even in those cases, I want teams to be ready to play their guys and not to default back to such a conservative week one approach. And yet, on the other hand, there aren't that many football games, even with the additional football game, and you've got to be ready to win. The Rams clearly felt like that was going to be a difficult game to win against the Lions. They could have won it. They were in position to potentially do so. And in week one, you have to play the guys who are ready to win in week one. As you mentioned at the start, it was incredibly exciting to see the rookie receivers so involved with that. Those guys, in many cases, are going to blow up. We're going to get that at the running back position as well, a position that in many ways is not as difficult.
So much to come. We could do this for hours, Sean. You wanted to talk a little bit about your ranks. Is there anything um specific that you wanted to?
Well, yeah, I'm gonna grill you a little bit. I did want to mention a couple things I thought were interesting from the Zero RB universe. Obviously, we'd love to have anybody who is still kind of on the fence to subscribe over at RotoViz, coupon code RVRadio 2024 at checkout for 10% off your 1-year subscription. Then these were, I think, a few fun notes in that backs with superficially impressive week 1 performances, or maybe some good things to what they did, that SIS still gave very poor points above average grades to, included Brian Robinson, who had a 17% bust rate, a 0% evasion rate, and just 0.9 yards after contact. Isaiah Pacheco, who had a 0% boom rate and a below 7 evasion rate, and James Cook, who was at 0% boom and had 1.1 yards after contact. On the flip side, some guys who pretty clearly had bad week 1 performances but got very good points above average grades included Derrick Henry, who was at 0% bust and 2.6 yards after contact, and our guy, Jaleel McLaughlin, who was at 2.8 yards after contact, 20% evasion, 10% boom. All of these things that we're talking about, Ben, both from players who didn't play a ton, but even the guys who played a lot. And we're dealing with sample sizes that are minuscule. You want to be aware of what happened. At the same time, you want to be aware, in the same way you'd be aware of a random one-off of like week 8 of the 2014 season. You wouldn't be like, oh, well, this is the season, or these are the set of games that tell us anything.
I think when you talk about these superficially impressive performances where the underlying stuff isn't great, talked about with Mixon, you mentioned just now Brian Robinson, Pacheco, and James Cook were a couple of the other examples. We're talking about guys that if they're scoring, you're thinking, I mean, people are asking us, should I go trade for these guys, et cetera? It's like, I mean, no, you don't go buy high on guys that are not actually on an underlying basis looking like they're going to define this season. They're probably not actually elite hits, the big wins in fantasy football that we're searching for. They might score because their situational stuff might work in their favor. Like I was saying with Mixon, it could be favorable that they could give him room to run. But him scoring, first of all, I don't think there's any way he's going to get 30 plus touches every game, right? He got that in week 1. So when the touches start to come back a little bit and balance out a little bit more so that he's not getting massively overworked, him scoring is going to come, but it's not necessarily going to be at a degree that we know that like the 15 point per game running back scoring level is more replaceable through spot starts and those elements that you can find out there. It's the truly like legendary upside performances that we want to have exposure to. And so that's how I would take that. What you just said is that, those guys are probably not going to keep it up to the degree that it's going to define the season. And we're going to have wished that we had them on every team.
So I'm going to grill you on some rankings to see if I am looking at these things from a remotely calibrated perspective. Ben, we did our projecting the 2025 first and second round shows about a month ago. That one is always, that's probably the show that generates the most interest of all of the shows. The player that you had as the 2025 101 is the player that I have moved to number 1 in my rest of season rankings. Is that where Breece Hall should be after a sort of abbreviated but incredibly encouraging Monday Night Football appearance?
I had Breece 101.
101. Maybe you were Bijan.
I had Bijan 101. Okay. I thought that was going to be a Bijan question. I'm pretty sure I had Bijan 101 and Breece 102. In fact, I'm like 95% sure because I think we both had Bijan ahead of Breece. Maybe I'm misremembering that, but it's a Breece question, Sean.
It's a Breece question.
I wrote in Stealing Signals Part 1 that Bijan, his workload was, confirmed legendary upside. It was what I had hoped it was. He had the huge usage. I didn't think the Falcons could continue to look as ridiculous as they did offensively in week 1. Talked more about that on the Bill Barnwell show that I've referenced a few times now. And then the Brees game was played Monday night after I had written that. And then when I wrote up Brees on Tuesday, I wrote the same thing. And it's so funny because in the offseason, I made a point to be like, probably the least likely outcome is both of these guys are going to smash in a way that you didn't wish you had one or the other. Because the way that it usually happens, and I know you know this, Sean, but a lot of people are like, oh yeah, I split the difference. I took a lot of Bijan, took a lot of Brees, and that's fine. I did that too. But I think people are like, I'm going to be right on both. And it's like, no, one of those guys is usually going to score a lot more than the other. It's just the way that it works out. And you're going to be like, well, one was the legendary upside and one was the 18 points per game or whatever, and not amazing. But week one, they both looked like they're both ready to be legendary upside plays. I did get a little more encouraged by Brees. One of the things that was really encouraging was that his stacked box rate to run against was only like 10%. For Bijan, it was up around like 40%. Their workloads were very, very similar. I'm pretty sure Brees played every snap with Aaron Rodgers. Braylon Allen's 2 touches both came on the Tyrod Taylor drive. He's going to play more than we were a little bit worried about. I still have worries about the Jets' pace and their play volume and how they're going to operate. Rodgers likes to operate slow. The 37 plays that he was in for wasn't just because of the Niners. It's very similar to what I talked about with the Ramondre Stevenson and the Patriots playing ball control and why the Bengals didn't run a lot of plays. Jordan Mason is a big reason why the Jets didn't run a lot of plays. They were able to run the ball so effectively and keep the ball moving on the other side. The 49er side of the ball. The Jets' run defense needs to improve. Saleh very pointedly said in the post-game press conference that they would figure that blank out. So hopefully if they do go figure that out, if they get the ball back enough, you're going to get defenses that are going to do some of the stuff that I was talking about with Joe Mixon, where they're going to respect Aaron Rodgers, who threw the ball well. I mean, one of the other underrated parts of week one is that he's not – I mean, I was worried that he'd done so many drugs that he wouldn't even know how to throw a football anymore or something. I don't know. But he can still throw a football very effectively. After 2 years off and coming off an Achilles, he made some smart plays. He made some good passes. You're going to get defenses putting extra secondary players out there and trying to stop explosive plays in the pass game because it is Aaron Rodgers. And that is going to create running room for Breece Hall in a way that Bijan's got a little bit more of a problem there. I think in the next month or two, Breece is in a much better spot. I do think as either Cousins gets healthier or gets benched for Penix and that passing game actually develops, because it might take a little while for the Falcons. They might ramp up a little. But as that passing game develops, that things should open up a little for Bijan. I think he's still going to have a really strong second half. I still kind of lean Bijan, but man, both those guys are – it was really positive for week one for both of them. You have to be thrilled for both of them.
Yeah, I think they're going to be – I think they have that potential to be in the 25 point per game range, but especially Hall, because the offense is going to be so much more dynamic and because it just jumps off the screen, his ability to get downhill when there is space, whereas Robinson is just like still juking guys. You're like, run forward.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the standard that is, I mean, when you're thinking about someone who could be a 25 point per game guy, you've got to just, you've got to get downhill.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, to be a 17, 18 point per game guy, to be one of the best backs in the NFL, you can do what he does. It's just like, you need to break some big plays and you need to score some touchdowns. And Hall just looks better at that part.
And even with what I said just now, I probably didn't come to the right conclusion, because I just said that I think Breece is going to be a lot better over the next stretch. I mean, if his value is going to rise to that degree and all those things, I probably should be ranking him number one right now. I mean, I'm basically saying that in 3 weeks, if you ask me this question again, I'll say Breece, because he'll have scored meaningfully more and it'll be obvious. And then I'm just like, it would be crazy to be like, yeah, well, no, but Bijan's going to come back around. No, the offense looked really bad for Atlanta in week one. I do think that can't last, but I mean, it's hard to imagine that it's going to get way better in week two. The Breece stuff was very, very optimistic for him.
So I have Lamb, Hill, and Robinson in 2, 3, 4. I have maybe the best wide receiver of our era all the way up to number 5. Is that too aggressive after a game with 20 plus targets?
Cooper Kupp. I thought you were talking about Justin Jefferson. You're talking about Cooper Kupp at 5.
Do you think it's
People,
possible that Cup will consistently have 3 times as many targets as Justin Jefferson? Because
I do.
it seems possible to me.
I do think I love the ranking. I do think Cup belongs in the top half of the first round. I've seen a lot of sort of like, oh, the ways he was used helped him, this, that, and the other thing. The case that I've made in Stealing Signals, again, I made on the Barnwell show this week, was that you're looking for the ceiling outcomes. There are risks with Cup. He could get injured. It's very clear that this role as the number one with the Stafford McVay offense can lead to massive fantasy scoring. It was him in 2021. It was him in 2022 until he got hurt. He was still backing that up. And then it was obviously Puka Nacua last year when Kupp was playing injured. And now this year, Puka Nacua is on IR and the runway is there. And Kupp has 21 targets in week 1. The way that the volume can concentrate, and he is extremely talented even at this age, and he's certainly lost a little bit of a step. That's what matters. Like we've talked about a little bit in the offseason, people don't care enough about volume anymore in fantasy football, but targets matter, man. Like you said, the best receiver of our generation. I don't think you'd make the case that Cooper Kupp physically right now is the best wide receiver. He's lost a little bit. The volume's going to be there, and he's still talented as hell. So, I mean, it's like, yeah, he has to be up there. I love that rank. I think that's right.
Jefferson does come in just below him. AJ Brown, I moved up in part because I think you have to be moving some other folks down.
You moved Garrett Wilson down quite a bit.
You say you did?
I disagree with. I said you did if you have him below AJ Brown. I disagree with that. No surprise.
He just looked so lazy in that game. I still have him in the first round. I actually moved Trey McBride up a little bit. But the next part that is maybe extremely controversial, and one of the things that is fun about talking through these with you is that I do get a little bit of a sounding board before they publish. But Nico Collins, 12, Amon-Ra St. Brown, 13. Is the forward-looking situation for Collins good enough to justify something like that? And should we be concerned about, because for Jameson Williams, it was not just the targets, but how much he played and how involved he was even when he wasn't targeted. I don't think that saying someone should be ranked 13th. One of the things that you will sometimes get a lot of criticism for is if you have a really good player, 3 or 4 spots below where everybody else is drafting him, then folks think that you are somehow wildly out on him. And you're like, I mean, there are like 12 good players. Having Amon-Ra at 13 is not to say that his season is going to be a bust. But you and I, we love him, first of all, as a talent, as an NFL player. We were nervous about the team context, and so we generally passed on him when we had a chance in drafts. Mm-hmm. I don't think our rankings necessarily suggested that you needed to be all out, but it was certainly something that we were aware of when we were making our own picks and we talked about for all the shows. So not that his season is any way defined by week 1, but for people who are nervous, hopefully those shows helped you a little bit. I mean, 13 here is actually still very aggressive if you think that what happened with the Lions in week 1 could happen with some consistency throughout the year.
I think that's wildly justifiable. I think that's, maybe even a little high. The point you just made about Jameson Williams' play volume, I think is really important to emphasize. One of the things I talked about when we talked about Jameson all offseason was how his highest snap share of his career was in that last game of the year last year against San Francisco. He scored 2 touchdowns, one receiving, 1 rushing, because he had to work back from the suspension and finally became a full-time player, but not even a full-time player. In that game, 72% of the snaps. Earlier in the postseason against the Rams, 70%. Those are the only 2 games he had broken 70% of the snaps in his career to that point. He had a game at 68% in December of last year. He had a game at 65% in November of last year. But most of his career games so far had been like sub 70% snaps, certainly sub 60% even, but 85% of the snaps in week 1. He was on the field the whole game, right? That's definitely a different outlook than anything we've seen last year. And it makes what was a concentrated offense of like 4 studs that included both Gibbs and Laporta, especially in tight end premium, going really high. Laporta tight end 1 in basically all formats. In tight end premium, we had 3 Lions going in the first 15 picks of drafts. And the guy who scored the most points is the guy we're talking about right now, Jameson Williams. I don't think Jameson Williams is going to be the number 1 wide receiver, but now you have them, and you also have David Montgomery showing that he's going to be a part of this offense. Now, only 2 offensive touches to anyone other than those 5. Khalif Raymond runs a bunch of routes. He gets 1 touch all game. It was a end around in overtime. He didn't get a target. You're talking about Amon-Ra, Laporta, Jameson as the downfield weapons, and then the 2 backs as the rest of the offense. But the backs are going to play a ton. Amon-Ra's going to have his games. I think at the end of the season, the floor is high. The production's going to be there, but the down games are going to be more frequent when you have a 5th really meaningful person, right? Like, that's the way it's going to be. Sometimes the volume just goes to other guys. It's a little like the Niners last year where Ayuk was so good and he had 105 targets. That's not the exact scoring profile of Amon-Ra, obviously. He's going to have more targets, but as a lower ADOT guy, he needs a ton of targets. And he's a slot plus who adds stuff, after the target as well. But he's going to need a ton of volume to be a top 5 overall wide receiver, and it's just not going to be there in the full season way. It's going to be there in some games, but there's going to be some down games. I think 13's maybe even a little too high. I want guys there that I think can be top 5 end of season players. I don't know that he can this year because of James, unless there's injuries. I mean, that would be the big caveat. Like, you could have some contingent upside with him, but the way that he scores, he needs the 10 plus target games with consistency. He's going to have some big games. Again, I keep saying that. And the end of season floor is high, but there's going to be some more down games sprinkled in that keep the end of season stuff from being top 5, getting up there and be when I'm picking right now, rest of season at the 1-2 turn, I want a wide receiver that has a case for being up there with Lamb and Tyreek Hill. And I just don't know that Amon-Ra does right now.
After those guys, I have a stretch of running backs, and these may be the 3 most controversial names in all of fantasy football right now, or certainly if you put them together in this section of the draft. If you were going to do a rest of season draft, and this would be a good time to note that if you want to do some rest of season drafts, then the guillotine leagues are perfect for doing any of that. You just need to get the number of people together with the number of weeks left. Play those. We will be talking about our guillotine team. And one of the reasons that we didn't draft QBs is that we were able to very inexpensively add Joe Burrow after week 1. And I'm not even that excited about that because I'm not very confident in Burrow, but we'll stack those guys in. And I mean, I don't know if Burrow's going to be worse than Aaron Rodgers, which one of the other names we had there, Justin Fields, didn't score that many points for us. But I've moved Barkley all the way up to 14. I've got Gibbs at 15, and I have Christian McCaffrey down to 16. We've discussed Barkley a ton. I am very enthusiastic about what he's going to do the rest of the way. Jahmyr Gibbs really did dominate this game in between the first and last possessions. I mentioned to you early in the show about getting close to the EP double-double. He also had a short yardage score, which I think is interesting, not because he's going to suddenly get a ton of short yardage work when they have David Montgomery on the team, but it was one of the best short yardage carries by any back in the entire NFL in week 1, and he got it overturned in his favor, which is good for fantasy managers, but also allows everyone there in the stadium, including the coaching staff, to really focus on how impressive that effort was as he got the ball across that line. I think that is pretty exciting.
It's a good point. Yeah. It's a favorable thing that'll stick with people. I mean, that was a really athletic contortion of his body to get the ball across the line.
And one of the things coming out of college for him was that he had this electric playmaking ability and just insane is probably an exaggeration, but very good receiving metrics. And you could look at him and see like a slightly lesser version of Christian McCaffrey, but his broken tackle metrics were much more like what you would expect for a small back. in a year and one game at the NFL level, those numbers have been much better as a professional, within context of what
Mhm.
expectation is, than they were as a college player, again, in relation to what you would expect going against college guys. That part, while I would argue is
Super
probably,
exciting.
yeah, I mean, probably unsustainable, but really cool.
Yeah,
And then with McCaffrey now, you don't know when he's going to play. Could be a
I think
timeshare.
that's
Jordan
right.
Mason looked fantastic. Some of the, I'm always a little bit skeptical about projecting an injury, like a more serious injury, because there is current soreness. But everything about this situation now has gotten very scary. I do think it's a little bit frustrating that the 49ers were not upfront with this because, I mean, it doesn't actually, I don't think, help you a ton in preparation. And I mean, you do have to prepare separately for McCaffrey. Um, but you feel bad for Jordan Mason kind of letting the cat out of the bag after he's had such an amazing game that he's got to deal with like the media and his own coaching staff, I'm sure, giving him a hard time for basically saying that he knew he was going to play. I mean, Jordan Mason was extraordinary. Just so excited for him. I don't know. This is just one of the things that happens in fantasy. I don't have a ton of McCaffrey simply because it's hard to get a bunch of 101s, but I do feel bad for people who burned their pick on him because the 49ers just weren't straight with people.
Yeah, it's a bummer. The way I wrote about it in my Wednesday post that was titled "Takes I Wish I Got into Signals This Week," and I went through some McCaffrey thoughts, was that Jordan Mason is probably just part of this offense now as well. I also wrote this in Signals. It was kind of a, you can't put the toothpaste back in the tooth. I think I said you can't put the cat's out of the bag. I don't know. One of those phrases.
You're not going to
Um,
unscramble the eggs.
yeah, right. The eggs are scrambled. Um, and so like Mason was so good that he's going to be a part of this offense going forward. I wrote that I don't think McCaffrey could be back to his normal workload until like week 8-ish at the earliest, unless we just find out that this was purely like just being careful, caution, and then they're like ready to go in week 2. You need some really positive news quick because we haven't gotten it yet this week. But I think what it means, it sounds like he's not going to play week 2 as well. Is what as we record this, the vibe sort of is. If he does play, you're not like, this is the exact type of injury that you don't push him to his normal 90% snaps, right? Like, and then when Jordan Mason looked as good as he did, you got the re-injury risk. You already have they'll be really cautious with him, and you're going to have to play him, but there might be some games where he plays like 30% of the snaps. I want to be real clear about that. The first game after they traded him, we told everybody you got to play him if they're going to play him, but he only played like 25% of the snaps. He didn't do much. It was the second game and then on that he just started being a superstar. And it wouldn't surprise me if he plays a little bit. He's just like, and then you talked about the potential for a long-term injury down the road as well, which is what they're going to be cautious about. And if they do, I don't think you want them to play him heavily right away, right? Like that's the other part of it, because then you're worried about that long-term injury. So how do you value him? Yeah, it's annoying that like you drafted him 101 and 5 days ago he was the 101, and today we're sitting here telling you he's a second round value, but I would trade him straight up for any of those players that you have him ranked ahead of him. Why wouldn't you? I mean, like, what is your expectation for CMC? What's the bull case now? It's that he gets ramped up in week 8 on, he gets back to the full load and he becomes himself again. That's probably the bull case now. So keep that in mind, that the bull case includes not a lot of production for the next couple months, not just next week. It's a little bit, not a lot of production, but not CMC level 90% of the snaps, getting every goal line touch kind of production. It's just going to be harder. He'll have some touchdowns, he'll have some good games when he gets back out there because he's so dynamic in the way that he can score for fantasy. And he could still be the late season hammer. Like I can still see why, like, this is why you didn't move him to the 5th round. There's still ways that CMC can be a guy who defines this season. But be realistic, I think, is what the message is to people. And I think ranking him in the high end of the 2nd round, probably fair. I don't think there's a lot of other players you would definitely trade him straight up for, but most of everyone you've named. Now, I want to ask you, you stopped at about 6 and then jumped to the 1-2 turn. Between there, was it mostly the 1st round picks from before? Is Garrett Wilson in there, or are we still waiting for Garrett Wilson?
No, he's in there at 11.
Okay. At
Yeah.
11? Oh, God, you moved him way too low. I just wanted to make sure you're not pushing him all the way late into the second. I'm sure Chase was in there. Did you move Achan up into the late first?
I did, but
Yeah.
that's a little bit fading
We don't know
some of
about
the
health.
health
Yeah.
stuff,
Yeah. The
which
health stuff. We were
could
recording
be
again Thursday morning. Yeah.
similarly bad. Yeah, Wilson looked so fast, so uncoverable, and also just so lazy. I play harder.
He
I
absolutely had to get his foot down on that play. That was an embarrassment for an elite receiver. I get so frustrated by those plays. You guys have heard me rant about it in season on stealing bananas in the past. He had so much room to drag. The point that I've always made is guys are afraid to go to the ground, or it seems like it. He puts his second foot down in a way that keeps himself on his feet, right? And so when you use the word lazy, I think on that play, it's absolutely laziness. It's absolutely a lack of focus. It's I don't want to go down to the ground. And so his steps are so long at that point because the pass is a little bit outside of his frame that he takes this huge step and puts it down on the line when all he has to do is drag that foot anywhere in a 5-foot span almost and then
He didn't
go
even
down
seem
to
to
his knees.
understand what had happened. I mean, it just he clearly didn't. It seemed more of a thing where he didn't understand where the line was, or he had forgotten about the need to get the second foot down. But you want to see him more consistently engaged in the game, and then given that they got a chance to practice before Rodgers was hurt last year, given the fact that they've had all of the time leading up to this again, in terms of being ready. Now, this can happen, but that short yardage play on fourth down has to be completed. And to me,
Yeah.
I mean, you said that you thought that Rodgers looked good.
That was a
It's
bad
so
throw.
crazy to watch him because the ball comes out of his hand so quickly once he decides. And when it comes out, it's more or less always a frozen rope.
Yeah.
But you can't miss that play. Like that
No.
was a play they have to make.
And it's one of the ones where he's kind of like doesn't have his feet under him and it's all like kind of upper body. The way that he's sort of always like floating when he throws and you're like, man, like you missed that throw because you didn't get your feet under you. Like he throws it down and behind him. That was a frustrating throw. The back shoulder to Garrett on the drive. Garrett caught 4 passes on their first touchdown drive and catches one that's a wide receiver screen in the red zone, gets down to the 3. Brees runs it in. He still winds up with 6 catches in this game. It's frustrating that he had 4 on one drive and only 6 in the whole game. Again, 37 plays with Rodgers. I mean, I think
He's going to have a huge season.
We're going to see Rodgers expand as things go.
I've got your guy Rasheed up to 17, but the next one I wanted to kind of take your temperature on here. And, in part it's because you get a lot of questions about the things that you're wrong on after week 1, but the real check comes in how you handle the things that you're right about or how you're kind of thinking through those. The biggest element I couldn't understand from 2024 was the lack of interest in drafting young receivers who had already broken out. I have Zay Flowers and Tank Dell up to number 20 and number 23, and the note is basically that the huge games are coming for these guys. Is 20 and 23 overall too high for the two of them?
I don't hate it. I don't know why Zay's thesis got so much better. I do think it was cool to see him be a focal point, and I think the big games are going to come, but I was already baking that in and have some volume concerns and now likely hit in a way that he's going to be a meaningful part of the pass game. I don't know why Zay would jump into the second round from where he was going prior. I don't think his situation, I think he looked good and it was positive and it looked solid. And I think he's still the number 1. And then Andrews is sort of the number 2 and likely sort of the number 3. But you now know that there's like a pretty meaningful number 3 in the offense as well. And there's not a ton of volume to go around. He's the one, maybe less so than Tank. So you now, I'm sure, have Tank ahead of Diggs, which I think is reasonable after week 1. Because some of the stuff that people are pointing out about the air yards is a little bit concerning. I've made the case in the offseason that you have to draft Diggs ahead of Tank. I think some of the stuff about week 1, you could say now that Tank should be ahead of Diggs. the response that I've talked about Diggs a lot this week, the response that I was coming back to, and my one tweet about it was that people were talking to me about it like he wouldn't even matter. And I continue to say this, I'm sure you have Diggs not far behind, is that people are talking about it like Diggs is not a part of the pass game and he's right there with those guys. You know what I mean? Like, so now it's my opinion has changed to where it's more, I could see Tank being ahead of Diggs for sure. But it's three really good receivers. It's not this idea that Diggs' air yards mean that he doesn't matter is sort of silly. Where did you land on Diggs in your ranks?
So I have him at 27, and I think that
Not far.
pretty clearly there's an element there where anyone who wants to note that all three of those guys are not going to live up to the rankings simultaneously, I do think that's fair. There is a little bit of a contingency-based element here where you're going to win with at least two of them, I think. But I just felt like even though the most frustrating takeaway from that game was that the Texans didn't pass nearly enough, and that in some ways CJ Stroud didn't look as extraordinary as he looked for almost all of his rookie season, that what we got instantly was verification of almost the best case scenario for all three guys, where Nico Collins looks like the alpha and made two fantastic catches. That's about the best case that you can have for him in week one. For Diggs, you get a situation where he is going to be the underneath chain mover and scored 2 touchdowns, which is absolutely fantastic. The thing that I noted in that article, kind of referencing our discussion about the Texans Colt game, is that the last time that he was relegated to almost exclusively underneath was in 2018 with the Vikings.
Yeah.
His ADOT was below 10 that year. He caught 102 passes for 1,021 yards and 9 touchdowns and finished as the wide receiver 10. The next year, his ADOT jumps over 15, which again, a reminder that he can play vertically if he needs to, and he finished as wide receiver 21. Now, my point there is not that losing some of the volume that's represented in air yards is necessarily good, but that especially in this offense, he could be wide receiver 10. And that wouldn't surprise. I don't think that should surprise people because you already saw how well it can work out for him. And again, this is a game where the Texans didn't pass nearly enough. They're going to have more total pass volume, which means the value of just stacking up those underneath receptions is going to be better than it appeared in this game, where the thing that people are mostly thinking about this game right now is, 2 touchdowns aren't sustainable. Well, the one thing is, like, if they score 50 receiving touchdowns as a group, which is very possible, then yeah, you're not going to score 2 touchdowns every game, but touchdowns are not going to be an issue. The overall reception numbers could be better. But then when you think about it from the Tank perspective, he was not a clear third guy in terms of routes. He was right there with him, and he was open for the long touchdown that Stroud missed on. Again, this was basically best case scenario for all three players.
It really was.
If you assume that the pass volume is going to be there. If the pass volume isn't there, that just would be devastating for me because I'm still all in on this offense.
The Diggs thing you wouldn't have seen that I sent out a tweet on, because I've seen a lot of people reference the air yards, is I went back and watched all of CJ Stroud's drop backs specifically for Diggs' alignment and routes, and he got all 6 of his targets more underneath. 2 of them come in the red zone for the touchdowns. Another is a swing pass. It gets negative 10 air yards on a design play that was also started inside the 10. His other 2 are 2 quick outs and a drag. Just because all 6 of his routes or targets went underneath does not mean that that's all he was running. When I went back and watched it, he ran about 10 to 12 vertical routes. They run a lot of different formations. They bench some stuff. He went vertically on a lot of stuff. I do still think Nico and Tank are way more likely to hit on vertical routes, but Diggs is going to get some air yards still. It's not going to just be that. So that was a note I wanted to get in there as well. But no, I agree with you. I think it was really positive for Tank. My concern for Tank was that he might come out and only run 70% of the routes or something. He was right there with him. And then like Dalton Schultz gets nothing. And like, and they ran a lot with Mixon, but it was very much like we know our offense is 3 wide receivers. And that's what we wanted to see for fantasy. That's perfect. It's amazing.
So I don't have as much Flowers as those other guys, but he just looks absolutely uncoverable. Now, the play volume makes the 10 targets not as meaningful when you think about what the play volume is likely to be. But you get those 10 targets, you get the 2 rushing attempts. I really strongly believe that Flowers and Dell, who also was involved as a rusher. And again, these rushing attempts are not a deal where they're going to dramatically move the needle. But when you have guys like Worthy and Dell and Flowers and Jameson Williams, who, the Jaden Reed deal there, we got rushing touchdowns from some of these guys already. It's not that is sustainable in any way, shape, or form, but it's another little piece where if you're electric with the ball in your hands, you can add some fantasy value. And the team is telling us that they know who their playmakers are and that they are dedicated to getting the ball in their hands. The thing that I think that we do want to be at least a little bit aware of sometimes when a team is telling you that they don't care about that you want to fade it to an extent because you still want to buy the talent, but you do have to keep it in the back of your mind that maybe the volume isn't going to be there. Certainly it's been something with the Falcons players in the past where the team just very clearly said, look, we don't think that emphasizing our playmakers matters. The teams that emphasize it, I really like. The teams that don't care about it, that part for me is disconcerting. I have Debo at 19 in part again because we saw right away that they want to get the ball to him. Then a few fallers as we wrap up today. I have Laporta down to 21. I have London down to 30. I have Neighbors down to 35. Harrison down to 37. Higgins down to 43. DJ Moore down to 54. Those are guys that we're not necessarily out on from a big picture perspective. So it's more relevant than just saying, well, somebody I already didn't have very high, I've moved down a little bit more. Any names there that jump out to you because you think that either week 1 was incredibly misleading or just that I've overreacted to what happened?
I think London's really interesting. Have talked about being into the Atlanta offense still to an extent. Because I think what happened in week 1 just can't happen again, is sort of my position. And yet I think that Pitts in some ways looked like the bigger hit right now. I mean, so the thesis for London was that he in some ways was going to need to be meaningfully better than Pitts because Pitts as the much cheaper tight end, if this is like a 50-50 thing, Pitts is the play, right? Unless the offense is just so amazing, in which case they're both the play. And a lot of the times we talked about when we had drafted London, it was like, well, we don't want to not draft Pitts because if you're drafting London, then the thesis is good for Pitts because Pitts was the clearer value on some of the offensive stuff. I guess in week 1, it looked to me like the idea that they could be equals was a lot more, was one of the big takeaways. And if that's the case, then London should be behind Pitts, straight up, right? And so I think where you dropped him to probably makes sense. There's still possibilities for him to be the stud wide receiver and for Pitts to not really be good. Again, the reason, if somebody was asked, well, why'd you have London ranked so high? Well, part of it was none of us have been fully confident in Pitts. We're a little bit concerned, right? It's not great, and I'm still not. If he's not good, then London's dominating the target thesis becomes even stronger. So there's layers, and I think after week 1, you have to feel like one of the things that stuck with me, I don't know if this was an earlier quote or not, but I mentioned it in Stealing Signals, was the announcers quoting Kirk Cousins as saying that Kyle Pitts is the best player on the offense, which we had some quotes from him earlier that were kind of like, oh, he had to teach Kyle Pitts how to play receiver or how to catch the ball. And people, were mocking Pitts with that stuff. But if Cousins is also saying he's the best player in the offense, then that's, I think, important, right? At least as far as the idea that London could dominate him in volume. That's not going to be particularly easy for London to do.
He didn't appear to be first reading Pitts very often. So that would be the other concern in terms of if he's the best player on your offense, then you need to speak with the offensive coordinator because you need to read him a little bit sooner.
Yeah. I think you have London in the right spot there. I think Neighbors sliding a little from offensive concerns is the other one I'd point out. Is like I think it's fair, but also like you didn't drop him that much. You have him in the middle of the third. I'd still be high on him. You have him ahead of Harrison, which I think is also fair because of the Harrison stuff. I mean, I don't know what happened with that. We got to see something from Harrison now. DJ Moore, Higgins because of injury concerns. DJ Moore because Shane Waldron concerns. I think are both very fair fallers. Yeah, nothing there strikes me as too odd.
So, final question: do you think that Keenan Allen is kind of back in the conversation to actually lead the Bears in receiving this year?
Yeah, definitely. I don't think he was never not in the conversation. And he led in targets in week 1. And the way that the offense didn't look super functional gets me back to like, he's going to need the sort of like a safety blanket, right? He's going to need like Caleb Williams is going to need to find certain things. And if Keenan Allen can still win on routes enough to get 11 targets in week 1, like that, it's very much in the conversation for him to lead the team in targets and catches.
Well, Ben, we could talk for another 4, 5, 6 hours, especially after week 1. We had so much fun coming to you guys on Sunday night. We will do that again. Make sure you have your notifications set for that. Ben has to run now to set up for the awesome Thursday night ship chasing show. Make sure you all are tuning in to that. Colin Kelly and I will have some more content for you at RotoViz Overtime. Make sure you're subscribed to those feeds. I'm Shawn Siegele. With me, as always, is Ben Gretch. You can follow at Yards Per Gretch, at Stealing Signals, at Stealing Lines. Make sure you're getting in there, getting that betting advice from Ben and Dalton Cates. Subscribe to the Stealing Signals YouTube. We'd love to have you at the RotoViz YouTube. Leave us a rating and review. Those help us a ton with the algorithm, especially right now when there's so much interest in the NFL. If you can throw in an exclamation point or something like that on some of these, it will help us build the show, which then allows us to do more content for you. Good luck in week 2. We love you guys. We'll talk to you soon.
Awesome.